You gotta have knowledge for life. You gotta have knowledge for life. You gotta have knowledge for life. You gotta have
Millions of poor people of color who have been rounded up in mass, branded felons, locked in cages, and then released to a permanent second-class status. There has been scarcely a peep from much of our elected leaders, many of our largest civil rights organizations. That's beginning to change. But for a long, long time, there was just an eerie silence. And we've got to break that silence.
That's right.
So this book is for you, for those who already care, but need the fact and data to back up. It doesn't present them, turn them away. So I want to talk with you about how I came to write the book, some of what's in it, but then let's have a conversation about what it really means to go from where we are in this room, the broader movement. I'm glad you mentioned, Martin Luther King Jr. in the early days, talking to, empty rooms and having people tell him, oh, sit down and quiet. That's not what we need to be talking about now. It's absolutely true. I watched the documentary, the Eyes on the Prize documentary, years ago. And there's this one scene that has always stuck in my mind when Dr. King is heading down, I believe it was Selma, and he's planning this huge demonstration, hoping thousands of people would turn out. Turns out they get there, nobody's around. Crowd, maybe 30, 40 people show up. He's thinking the news media is here. We're supposed to be having this major march. This is supposed to be really, culmination of much of the work we've been doing over the last year or so. What are we going to do? What does he do? They end up calling up their friends who are in the local school system and persuading them to release these high school students from school to have them come join the march. Now think about if that happened today. You have the Klan waiting for you, law enforcement is hostile to you, and you have civil rights activists calling up the school principal saying, why don't you send your babies out in the streets?
Right.
But that's what they did. Because the adults thought, I want to shake things up. It's not my problem. I got other business to do. This is going to cause more problems than it's going to solve. So that's how we wound up having school children being gunned down with water hoses in the street, was in large part because the grown-ups weren't turning out. And they emptied high schools so that kids would come running into the street to join this march that their parents were afraid to lead. Now, today, you say, oh, it'd be great if this room's packed. When I was in California and I was directing the Racial Justice Project at the ACLU there, we were, developing this large campaign against racial profiling in California, the DWB campaign, Driving While Black or Brown campaign. And I remember one of the first town hall meetings we planned. We did all of this organizing and all of this work, and we went to the town hall meeting. It was in Stockton, California, and it was being held in this big auditorium. And we show up, in fact, we were running a few minutes late. We get there and we walk in, the place was nearly empty. There was maybe, 15 people who turned out faces in the auditorium, walk up there, try to give a speech, talk about our plan of action, do the whole thing, and it was like echoing. Well, those people, I would say 10 of the 15 people who showed up became the core. Became the core of the organizing movement that we eventually built in California. And I remember walking out of that, that town hall meeting that day just feeling despondent, feeling like it was a waste of time, nothing was ever going to happen. And then sure enough, days later, the folks who started calling and saying, let's do this. Let's do this. Let's make this happen.
Right.
And so that small group of people, we called ourselves the Racial Justice Coalition, and we started planning town hall meetings, putting up billboards and ghetto communities with hotline numbers for people to call. We started organizing a movement against racial profiling that eventually, set off a national movement. And it started with a small group of folks who were disappointed that nobody showed up. Right? So we can do that here. We can do it here. And we can do it in other communities across America where it seems like not enough people care, not enough people are showing up. It doesn't matter how many we have today. What matters is that the people who are here care enough to do the hard work of movement building tomorrow. Now, a lot of folks, like myself, just don't get it. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I was one of the people who just didn't get how bad this system is and the way in which it actually operates like a racial caste system.
Right.
I just didn't get it. I myself had never been to prison. I was fortunate to be in a family where none of my family members had been to prison. My dad had been harassed a lot by the police, but he had never done time. It was something that was academic to me, something that I saw on the news, but I didn't know up close and personal. I got to know it up close and personal through my work, representing victims of racial profiling and police brutality and working with folks cycling in and out of the prison system and listening to their stories. And even then, there was a period of time when I still didn't get it. As I mentioned earlier today, it took a young man who asked me to represent him, who was actually innocent and I didn't believe him, to finally shake me into realizing that so many of the things that I thought I knew about the criminal justice system were false, that I believed a lot of myths, that I had my own biases and baggage that I would bring into this work, and that I needed to start thinking independently, thinking for myself, and doing the hard work of research and seeking out the truth wherever it could be found, and listening to the stories of people cycling in and out of the criminal justice system. And as I began that process of awakening, I had a series of experiences and came across information that blew my mind. Just blew my mind. I had a revolution in my own mind about how the criminal justice system was operating in our communities. And as I began to learn that there are more African Americans under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved. Enslaved in 1850, I started to shift my perspective and ask harder questions. As I learned that, there are more African Americans disenfranchised today than in 1870, again, I started asking harder and harder questions. And the more I dug and the more I uncovered, I came to realize we now have a system that functions as effectively as Jim Crow once did in locking a huge segment of the African American community into a permanent second-class status for life. When you can have large, major urban areas in the United States, across the United States, from LA to Oakland, to Chicago, Baltimore, DC, where more than half of young black men have criminal records or behind bars. This isn't the product of crime rates. I believed once it was the product of crime rates. It's not. It's not true. Crime rates have gone up, have gone down, have fluctuated. It's not driven by crime rates. Today, crime rates are actually at historical lows. But incarceration rates have consistently soared. This system has been driven by politics, by racial politics. It is the product of a backlash against the civil rights movement. If you want to trace where this get tough rhetoric began, go back to segregationists. The law and order and get tough rhetoric began when segregationists started feeling the heat of the civil rights movement and started trying to portray civil rights activists as criminals and calling for law and order. That's where it began. And they found it was incredibly successful by portraying civil rights activists, increasingly African Americans generally, as criminals. They could appeal to those poor and working class whites who felt threatened by and resentful of the civil rights movement, and get them to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party. And that's the origins. That's the origins of mass incarceration, not crime rates. So people ask me, what's the root of the system? Why is it the root of it? Is our failure to cultivate care, compassion, and concern across racial lines. It's the failure of us as a nation to care as much about the fate of that kid in the hood as they do about the kid in the suburbs. Who among us would want anyone we cared about to be branded a felon and subjected to a lifetime of discrimination, scorn, and social exclusion for a relatively minor mistake? Nobody. We wouldn't wish that on anybody we actually cared about. But in poor communities of color, you're caught with a little bit of dope, you get in a scuffle at school, you're in the system, you're branded, and you're toast for the rest of your life.
Right.
You don't do that to people you care about.
Right. That's it.
So at the root of this is the failure of us as a nation, even as we elect the nation's first black president, to extend the same care, compassion, concern, love, righteous love for people on the other side of the tracks, in the hood, as we do for the kids who live in the burbs, on college campuses, universities.
That's right.
That's the core of it.
Right.
And I think the faith community has an incredibly important role to play.
There you go.
Because we can talk till we're blue in the face about the statistics, data, all the studies that have been done, the biased police practices, all the barriers to reentry. But if we don't address that, if we don't finish the work that Dr. King began, of inspiring care, compassion, concern, love across race, across class, no matter how successful we are in reforming the criminal justice system, those racial divisions, that lack of compassion will continue to birth new caste systems. We as a nation will find new excuses for denying people basic civil rights, their basic human rights. It will happen again and again and again. So we've got to talk seriously about how we go from few people in this room to a much broader movement.
Right.
And I think one of the first steps is creating spaces for people to begin to talk openly about their experiences behind bars, their experience waiting for their son to come home, or their boyfriend, or their brother, what this feels like. Now, there's been a silence about this because there's so much shame and stigma associated with criminality. There's this wonderful study that was done. It was published in a book called Doing Time on the Outside. Highly recommend it. In this study, it was an ethnographic study, which means it's a study of not just data, but how people are living. In Washington, D.C., in neighborhoods hardest hit by mass incarceration. I mean, these are neighborhoods where literally you go to every house or every apartment and, everybody's got somebody behind bars. One of family members behind bars were just recently released from prison. I mean, these are neighborhoods where you would think that just everybody would just be talking all the time about each other's criminal records, criminal history, just be part of normal conversation. Even in those neighborhoods hardest hit by mass incarceration, they couldn't find a single person who had fully come out to their friends, neighbors, loved ones about their own criminal history or that of their loved ones. There was still so much kind of shame and stigma associated that it was just like, well, they don't need to know that. Yeah, my brother did time out. We don't need to talk about that. Oh, yeah, where's my uncle? Yeah, he's out of town.
Right.
He's out of town. There's this shame about it that creates this silence. And as long as there's that silence, collective political action this criminal. Just today, as I was book signing, I had several people lean down and whisper to me, you know, thank you, my son's doing time. Thank you. There was a whisper.
Right.
Because just didn't necessarily feel comfortable letting everybody know. You didn't just want the person staying behind you in line in a forum where we're here to talk about it.
Right.
That's
the heavy stick.
Right? That's got to change.
Right.
And I think it begins by recognizing that we're all sinners.
Yeah.
We're all criminals. The criminals aren't the bad guys over there.
Right.
Right? It's all of us.
And that the
It's all of
system
us.
is unjust.
There isn't a single person in this room who hasn't broken the law.
Right.
If you're guilty of speeding down the freeway, you have put yourself and others in far more danger than smoking a joint on your couch in the privacy of your living room. You have done more harm or potentially done more harm than people who are serving life sentences in prison today. There are people doing life sentences in the United States for first-time drug possession. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld as constitutional life sentences for first-time drug possession. Yeah, it's not cruel and unusual punishment. Never mind that no other country in the world has such a thing.
Barbaric.
That's here in the United States. We've got to begin to recognize that each one of us have made mistakes, big and small, have caused harm, caused suffering in different ways. Some of us got caught, some of us didn't. Some of the sins we've committed are against the law, some of them aren't. But whether you've been branded a felon, branded a criminal, or not, we are here to support you when you're committed to getting your life on the right track.
Right.
And we are committed to ending all forms of discrimination against those who've been branded. You're not going to be checking the box on employment applications for the rest of your life. You know, even when you're 65 years old trying to find a job, checking that box because it's something you did when you were 22.
Right.
You're not going to be automatically excluded from public housing. Housing is a human right.
That's right. Right.
Housing is a human right. You're not automatically excluded from public housing because you're suspected criminal activity. No. It's a human right. We're going to find ways to ensure that people have work, have housing, get access to food, food stamps. This is a human rights movement. The recognition of the dignity and humanity of all people, no matter who you are or what you have done, you are entitled to basic human rights and respect, basic decency. And that is something that we deny to millions of people in the United States today. Millions. Your wonderful poem inspired by the I Am a Man. That sign that the sanitation workers wore, that's right. That same sign could be worn today.
That's right.
People, men returning home from prison. I am a man. Treat me with the dignity and respect. Treat me as a human being. That's what we don't do today. Now, I say, movement building sometimes, and people kind of go, oh, movement building. What's that mean? Lots of marches, how are you get thousands of people in the street? How do you just go build a movement? And people could get a little intimidated by it. It seems overwhelming. Build a movement to end mass incarceration. Well, keep in mind, it wasn't that long ago that, a small group of people dared to say, we're going to build a movement to end Jim Crow. There were people who said, we're going to build a movement to bring slavery to an end. People who are abolitionists, and it sounded crazy.
Right.
People just, how do you do that? It's not happening. It's not happening in our lifetime. But they did.
Right.
And so we don't need to think today about how we get thousands of people in the streets. Start small and say, well, how do we fill the room next time?
Yeah.
Right? How do we fill the room next time? That's where you start.
Yeah.
How do you create a forum, a town hall where people can begin to stand up and come to the microphone and tell their stories. I was released from prison, and since then this is what has happened to me.
That's good.
And once people are able to tell their stories, you can then begin to develop what are our plans of action, what are our demands.
Right. Break down that stigma.
And that's the next step. You know, one step will emerge as you take this. Dr. King had this wonderful, speech where he said, you don't have to see the whole staircase.
Right.
You don't have to just see the next step. Just take the next step. The next step. What is the next step? And that's something we can figure out here today. So anyway, I'm very, very happy to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me. And I want to take any questions that you have or comments, and let's just try to open it up to a conversation document.
How do you take that first step?
Well, in my view, I actually dedicate the last chapter of the book to kind of talk about the need for movement building. But I think that the next step may vary depending on where you are, what community you are in. So I'm reluctant to prescribe kind of a recipe for every community, every area. But just based on my experience doing work around kind of the issue of racial profiling, I think the most important first step is giving space to people to tell their stories, to break the silence. And what we did, I'll just share with you what we did in California that worked incredibly well. So we held these town halls, which I described. First couple didn't go so well. Town halls where all they were was people called up to tell their stories. We had an advocate who would come up, often me or someone else would come up and paint the big picture. Here's what's happening in the United States, skyrocketing incarceration rates. Here's the role of the police. Here's the role of the police by stopping and searching and frisking, every black man that they see on the street who looks like, possible drug criminal. This is what is helping to fuel mass incarceration and resulting. We would paint the big picture, but then we'd say, now we're going to allow folks to come up and tell their stories. And we would invite law enforcement. And they were invited to sit in the front rows, but they were not allowed to speak. Politicians would be invited, but they would not be allowed to speak. Our rule was, you are here to listen.
Right.
For once, please listen. You are here to listen. Just come and listen. We've been talked at for a long time. Just come and listen what people have to say. And they did. Especially once we started getting a lot of media attention and after we've invited the chief of police, we've invited, a list of politicians. Will they show? They began to feel that they needed to show that they cared. And they would come and sit, and we would have lines, people coming up to the microphone telling their story about what it felt like to be stopped and targeted by the police, what it felt like, to be face down on the pavement while your, 8-year-old son is in the back seat of the car watching it happening. Mothers talking about what it felt like, to get the call, from the jail. My son's been picked up. He doesn't even know what he's charged with. He doesn't even know what he's done wrong. Kids being beat up, the whole telling the stories, and you cannot help but be moved and feel a human connection to someone after you have heard their story. And after the stories were told, advocates would come to the front and say, well, here's what we're going to do next. Sign up if you want to join the movement. And soon enough, we started getting, the numbers began to increase. More and more people started turning out to the town halls. The media became interested in covering the storytelling and the movement that was building. And we wound up getting hundreds and thousands of people out to town halls and to demonstrations and really mobilizing a movement that, helped to set the stage for people beginning to know what the term DWB meant. Racial profiling meant.
Yeah.
Now, we can do that. That's not necessarily the recipe of what would be the best strategy here, but it's one possible thing to consider. It's the type of thing to consider. In faith communities, in churches, beginning in services, to create space for people who are returning home from prison to come up and start sharing their stories. So that we start breaking the silence in those places where, collective action could be possible. So, I think there's a number of ways, but I think that telling the story, breaking the silence, raising consciousness, sharing information, videos, books, whatever you can get your hands on that will help to awaken folks from, their apathy or their slumber, is the beginning. Is the beginning. Is the first step on the staircase, I would say.
Are you ever going to go to any prisons and talk? People in prison don't know about your book.
Yeah, I actually did a talk at a prison outside of Seattle.
What about Ohio?
Yeah, I'm supposed to go to up to Richmond, and I'm going to be doing that in
But those
1
are,
or 2 months.
like the prisons up north are different than the prisons down here. You hear more about stuff like that up north, and we don't hear. I was at Lebanon, I've been to Madison, I've been to Noble, I've been to different prisons down south, and we don't usually hear about black people. Period. All we hear about is the Caucasian American.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things I'm doing is I'm raising a bunch of money. The book isn't going to come out into paperback until August of 2011. But I know a lot of prisons won't allow hardback books to come in prison. So we're raising money to buy the book in bulk, paperbacks, and send them to prisons and find ways to get them into prison so they can be passed around in prisons and conversations can begin. One of the wonderful things at the prison in Seattle was that there was this group called the Black Prisoners Caucus. It was a group of prisoners that had organized themselves in the late 70s, actually, and still existed and had grown. And in Seattle, or in Washington State, they have a 3 strikes law where your third strike can be anything. Okay, your third strike can be anything. And when you get that third strike, your official sentence is 777 years, 77 months, 7 days. Now, that to me is an expression of contempt, right, and hostility. It's not, that it's so far over the top that it's almost like, the legislators giving the middle finger to a whole population of people, right? 777 years. Now, there are young men in there with that 777-year sentence. One who got his third strike robbing a grocery store, $50 worth of groceries, shoving somebody on the way out, third strike, 777 years, right? Well, this Black Prisoners Caucus, folks, they were comprised mostly of lifers, people who probably never get out. Some of whom are quite old now. They were committed to educating and raising the consciousness of the young folks coming into the prison, trying to educate them, empower them, so that when they go back out, they'll be armed to do kind of the organizing work and have a consciousness to try to not come back in. And that's what they saw their role as. And so people who you think would have no hope, people who are never getting out of prison, I was just unbelievably impressed. They just incredibly, educated themselves, knew more about some of the stuff I was talking about than I did, because they had committed themselves so fully to the education of those who were coming in and organizing those who go out. So I think figuring out ways to organize within prison, do consciousness raising in prison, is critically important.
I have a question. What about women? Women are always different. And I want to let everyone know that there's a program on Channel 16 called Need to Know. It comes at different times, and I think it replaced the program called Now, with David Brancaccio. So it's called a Need to Know. When you mentioned about young men getting umpteen years of sentencing, there was an attorney that was featured on there about this young man who got, I call it umpteen years for doing something. And in one of the articles I gave you, there's an article in there about a young man getting a bunch of years. They interviewed him, and he wasn't able to speak very well. You could tell he had a mental challenge. But whether you're in Montgomery County Jail, we say jail, or whether you're in prison doing hard time, big house, where do the women fit in, and why is Dayton so difficult to welcome people back? I mean, I used to say, there by the grace of God go I, but I now say, there by the grace of God go I, or any family member of mine. And I'm concerned about the women.
That's an excellent question. You know, my book focuses primarily on the experience of African American men in the system, but women, especially black women, are the fastest growing group in the prison system. Because of the drug war. Again, just as, you know, the prison boom for men has been driven by the drug war and the aggressive arrest and prosecution of, you know, relatively minor offenses, the same has been true for women. But, you know, the fate of women today, I think, really threatens to unravel the black community as a whole. If the trend continues, you know, black families are fragile enough as it is. That's right. Without, you know, men being present in most black families today, often due to incarceration or unemployability and all of the rest. You know, it's been black women who have been kind of holding it together, the last thread, right? Holding it together. Well, with women being arrested in growing numbers, that last thread is being cut in many communities, and you see that, you know, children wind up in foster care, then bouncing from home to home, you know, for the rest of their lives, and then once they're released from foster care, often, usually, typically within 2 years, find themselves in the prison system. So, you know, we have to be, you know, particularly concerned, I think, about the rapid increasing incarceration of women. And also pay a lot of attention to the rules that govern reunification once people are released from prison. So, you know, a lot of times people are released from prison and then a condition of their reunification with their children is a bunch of conditions that they can't meet because they've been branded felon and can't get a job and can't get housing, right? So if you, by law, are allowed to reunify with your children and regain custody until you have a home, but you can't get a home because you're barred from public housing, no matter how much you love your children or are committed to being a wonderful parent, kids are to be stripped from you and put in foster care. And now that so many people have been branded felons, these children can't even be placed with other relatives because if somebody in the home has a criminal record, they can't be placed in that home. So here you have an aunt, you know, a sister, a grandmother who says, I want to take him in, but there's a boyfriend or a husband or a son, somebody who has a criminal record in the house, can't take him in. And so now you have a child who has a loving family who wants to care for them being placed into foster care. So there's an extra dimension of the rapid incarceration of women that, you know, isn't really acknowledged now, given the fragility of the black family already. Yeah.
Hi, I want to first thank you for being here. Like my husband said, I too love you, sister. I am so thankful for you being here. Your book is remarkable. I just want to give a little bit of my story. When my husband was incarcerated, I wrote a little haiku that said, I too have served time, though I am what they call free as an inmate's wife. I've been discriminated against because of my husband's incarceration. When my husband was to come home, 3 months before he was to come home, his PRC, not parole they said, PRC, which is essentially kind of the same thing. You got to pay $20 per month to have someone go to someone for, you know, the next 4 or 5 years. PRC officer called me and said, there's no need for me to come and inspect your place because your husband's not going to be able to live with you when you come home because you live in public housing. For almost 2 years, we could not live together after my husband came home. But this man was there every morning to get our daughter off to school. He was there every night to kiss our daughter, to let her, you know, to kiss her before she went to bed. He stayed with his mother. We spent as much time together as we could. And of course, today we are living together, praise God. But I mean, I'm just, it's hard. It's really hard. I lost a job. They'll never say that's the reason I lost it, but I lost a job because after my husband came home, they found out my husband was in prison. You know, even though they knew before, they didn't find out they knew before, but I guess him being there, you know, he was there in the flesh then. You know, and then it was all the church. If I worked at a church, they had a meeting about what are they going to do. Candace's husband was in prison. What are we going to do with this, you know, with this whole, you know, You know, I lost a job. I lost a job because my husband had been in prison. You know, and these are the different things that are going on, and people don't know it. You know, people don't know it. You don't want to tell anybody, but you think, oh, everybody's going to judge. No one's going to ever, whether he was guilty or innocent, no one would ever believe it, no one would care. And if he was guilty, he did his time. You know, if he did his time. When you come home, it's like you're so discriminated against, and you're afraid to tell people because it's like, you know, my husband is a very likable person. You know, you love him or you don't. He's genuine. He's very outgoing, and majority of people I know really like him. But then as soon as they find out that he did time, then all of a sudden they want to shun him, they want to shun us. All of a sudden this man that they love, you know, we can no longer speak to because we found out that he did prison time. You know, those are just some of the things that people who have long been incarcerated and their families go through. I just wanted to.
Yes, and you know, in that way, in which you just described, you know, this system has been more damaging to the black community than Jim Crow itself. Yes. Because, you know, during Jim Crow, at least black folks felt they were all in it together. Yes. Right? Yes. You know, as bad as it was, you know, out there, you come back to your community, your church, there's an understanding that we're here to support one another. But with mass incarceration, the black community has been turned against itself. You know, and you know, during the Jim Crow era, light-skinned blacks tried to pass as white, you know. Well, today, people, branded felons, and their families try to pass, you know, not just by lying to employers and coworkers, but each other, trying to keep it silent, because the shame and stigma, the discrimination from your own community is so intense. And that's not to say that, you know, we can't, you know, have opinions and judgments about the crimes people commit. You know, you can be angry about crime in your community. You can want it to stop. You can be mad about it. But you gotta still love the criminal. And that's where I think, you know, faith is so important. And cultivating, you know, this sense of no matter how bad things may be, how much you may hate what happened, you've got to still find a place in your heart to love the one who did it. And if you can't do that, then you can talk all day about your faith in God, but you can't love your brother.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, I'm there.
Craig, back here, he's been on
Craig, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you back there.
It was great.
Oh, okay. Thank you again for being here, and I appreciate your presentation, both the content and the style of presentation. It revealed this, you know, the humanistic part, revealed a lot about yourself. So I feel like I've gotten to know you. But I want to make sure I'm clear. I'm a practitioner, professionally involved with this. I want to be clear on what the end in mind is. You had a significant argument on the racial inequality that exists in the system. Man, I hope I don't leave here thinking we got to have racial harmony in America before this problem is solved. So I want to be clear on, is it legislative changes that, what's the end in mind? I want you to make sure, reiterate what the end in mind is. As you move around the country talking to different groups, we in this community, we're going to approach this thing in a certain way, but I hope we're all moving in the same direction. What is the end in mind, short of racial harmony in America?
Well, I don't know if you're going to like my answer. You know, in my last chapter of the book, I describe a laundry list of concrete reforms that have to be made. We need to end mandatory minimum sentences, end three-strike laws. We need to end racial profiling by the law enforcement. We have to adopt racial impact statements, which I could talk more about the impact of laws and policies on racial communities defined by race. We have to end, as I mentioned, all forms of discrimination against those who've been branded criminals. There have been successful movements to ban the box on employment applications. We need to make public housing available to people who are returning home from prison. We need to make food stamps available to everyone. Food is a human right. You shouldn't be denied food stamps because of a felony conviction, from drug conviction you have. in the past. So there is a laundry list. There is more than enough reform work that needs to be done to dismantle mass incarceration in this caste-like system that we've created.
Legislative action is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely, there's all of that, but, and this is a big but, and you don't have to agree with me about this, but I do believe that our ultimate goal is racial harmony in the United States. That is our ultimate goal, and if we fall short of it, however, whatever the distance is that we fall short of that goal, that's the shape of what the next system will look like. So, we can fall short of it and say, well, we don't want to have to end. In fact, I had this meeting not too long ago at the Drug Policy Alliance, which is working to reform, our nation's drug laws. And the Drug Policy Alliance, like most drug law reform organizations in the United States, is, overwhelmingly white. And I gave a presentation about my book, and it was very well received. People within the organization agreed about the impact of drug convictions and the harm of the drug war. But the point you just made was made by one of the senior staff there saying, well, you can't tell me that we have to end racism in America before we end mass incarceration. You can't tell me that that's what we have to do, because that's too much. And I said, well, okay, then don't. But just get ready for the next thing, because if you allow to stand, the kind of bias that gave rise to mass incarceration, if you don't actually deal with that, if you don't talk about it, if you don't excavate it and work to heal it, there's going to be another system. No one, 50 years ago, no one could possibly even imagine a system like mass incarceration in the United States. We can't today imagine what the next thing could be, 50, 60, 70 years down the road if we end mass incarceration but don't really reckon meaningfully with the problem of racism, racial division in the United States. That is our task, and that's the work that Dr. King was committed to at the time of his death, and that I fear that we kind of lost along the way. As civil rights advocates and many other really devoted, well-meaning folks have, focused their energy on policy reform, but have neglected, the work, the soulful work of healing our racial divisions in the United States. Those racial divisions have been allowed to stand, fester, and gave rise to another system of control. So yes, there is a ton of reform work, legislative reform work that needs to be done. There's a ton of work that needs to be done in our own communities, raising our own consciousness about these issues. There's work in terms of reforming our school systems and creating jobs. There's just a tremendous amount of work, but there's also, or I should say, as we do that work, we need to look for opportunities to talk about race and our racial divisions openly and seek to heal them. Because if we don't, we'll just be doing this all over again, a half century from now.
You gotta have knowledge for life. You gotta have knowledge.